Here's what the DNA showed. And I'm going to tell you right now, before we go anywhere else, because this is the kind of finding you need time to sit with. The people living in Poland before the Slavs arrived carried ancestry closely linked to Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Strong genetic ties, deep roots, and then beginning around the 6th century CE, they vanished. Not slowly, not through war that left mass graves. They were simply genetically replaced. Within roughly 2 generations, over 80% of the gene pool in Eastern Germany and Poland had been overwritten by people moving in from the East. And the population that had been there before? Less than 7% of their DNA survives in any Polish person alive today. That number stopped me cold. Not because the migration happened. Migrations happen. What stopped me was the implication on the other side of it. There was a people. They lived there. They had children and burial practices and a relationship to that land. And we don't know their name. We have never given them one. And the civilization that replaced them, the one that became Poland, that became the Slavic world, was built entirely on top of their disappearance. This is where the story begins. In the summer of 2025, a team led by Dr. Joshua Gretzinger at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig published the first comprehensive ancient DNA study of medieval Slavic populations, 555 ancient individuals, 26 sites stretching from Eastern Germany to Croatia to Poland's Ukrainian borderlands. It is the largest genomic portrait of the Slavic expansion ever assembled, and what it revealed was not the story anyone expected. Not even close. The Slavs were real. The migration was real. The scale of it, the speed of it was extraordinary. But underneath that story was another one, Queeter, much harder to name. And the data had been sitting in the ground in burial sites like the one at Grodek, near Hrubieszów in eastern Poland, waiting for someone to sequence it. At Grodek, archaeologists found something unusual. Among the earliest Slavic inhumation graves ever excavated in Poland, meaning bodies buried whole, not cremated, which is what makes ancient DNA recovery possible, were individuals whose genomes matched what you'd find in modern Ukraine and Belarus. They had arrived. They had settled. They had buried their dead differently from the people who came before them. And the people who came before them were almost entirely gone. If you've ever genuinely wondered where you come from, not the family story, the real biological answer, subscribe. Because what comes next goes deeper than most people are willing to go. The unnamed population that preceded the Slavs in Poland had strong genetic ties to Northern Europe and Scandinavia. They are the cliffhanger that this entire episode is built around, not who the Slavs were, but who they replaced and why nobody, in over 1,000 years of telling this story, has ever stopped to ask. Actually, before we go further, I want to know something. Drop it in the comments. If you carry Slavic ancestry, do you know from which branch? Polish, Ukrainian, Czech, Balkan? And has anyone in your family ever told you something about your origins that didn't quite add up? I ask because, and I mean this, your answer might be more connected to what I'm about to show you than you'd think. For decades, the origins of the Slavs were archaeology's most productive argument. 2 camps, 2 completely incompatible positions, both defended by serious scholars with serious evidence. The first camp said the Slavs were always there, that they had occupied the lands of modern Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus since at least the Iron Age, developing slowly in place. The second camp said no. They came from somewhere east of where we find them, moving rapidly into a post-Roman power vacuum and bringing their culture with them. The problem was that proving either side was nearly impossible, because between roughly 500 CE and 800 CE, the Slavs cremated their dead, and cremation destroys DNA. Every urn held a person. None of them could speak. That's what made Grodek so important. The inhumation burials at Grodek, whole-body burials, not urns, gave researchers something they almost never get from early Slavic contexts, retrievable genomes. And when the Leipzig team sequenced them, the results pointed toward one specific region, an area stretching from the Dniester River in the west to the Don River further east, the heartland of modern Ukraine and southern Belarus. Dr. Gretzinger put it precisely. Our genetic results offer the first concrete clues to the formation of Slavic ancestry, pointing to a likely origin somewhere between the Dniester and Don rivers. That's not a vague region. It's a specific corridor, and it matched what linguists had been arguing for years based on Proto-Slavic vocabulary, words for rivers, for fish species, for tree types, that placed the original Slavic-speaking population exactly there, in the forest steppe zone northeast of the Carpathians. The DNA and the linguistics were pointing at the same place. But here's where it gets strange, because that confirmation, satisfying as it was actually the least surprising thing the study found. What the data showed about the movement itself, about the speed and the structure of how these people traveled and settled, rewrote everything historians thought they understood about how a migration actually works. They didn't arrive as warriors. They didn't arrive as scattered refugees. They arrived as families. Multi-generational pedigrees, grandparents, parents, children, moving together, settling together, building new communities around extended kinship networks more elaborate than anything the people before them had practiced. The DNA from cemetery sites in eastern Germany showed men and women in equal numbers, no sex bias in the migration, entire households, not raiding parties. And the people who had been living in those lands, the ones with the Scandinavian genetic ties, they were already almost gone before the Slavic communities were fully established. The question nobody in the field had fully confronted was now impossible to avoid. Not, where did the Slavs come from? But, what happened to everyone else? Here is what every textbook on this subject has said in one form or another for the past 200 years. The Slavs expanded, they spread, they assimilated the local populations they encountered, absorbed their cultures blended with them. This is the comfortable version, migration as integration, movement as merger. Nobody disappears, they just become part of something larger. The DNA said the opposite. In Poland, the team found close genetic affinities between the Iron Age wheelbarrow culture, the pre-Slavic population whose burial sites dot the Polish landscape, and contemporary Northern European and Scandinavian populations. These were real people with a distinct and identifiable genetic profile. And then, starting in the late 6th century, that profile begins to disappear from the archaeological record. Not gradually, sharply. Within what the data suggests is roughly 2 generations, the genetic makeup of the region shifts so completely that less than 7% of those earlier inhabitants' DNA survives in the modern Polish population. This is not assimilation. Assimilation leaves more than 7%. Dr. Irina Stolrek at the University of Warsaw was part of the team that examined wheelbarrow-associated genomes specifically, 474 individuals from 27 cemeteries across Poland. What his team found confirmed the picture. The people who had lived in that territory before the Slavic arrival were genetically distinct from the people who came after them. Not a little distinct, substantially different. The kind of difference that only comes from a near-complete population replacement. And yet, and this is the part that deserves more attention than it gets, there was no evidence of mass violence. No destruction layers in the archaeology, no weapon injuries in the bones, no fortifications built in panic. The pre-Slavic population did not appear to have been massacred. They appear to have simply, numerically, biologically, been overwhelmed. When a much larger incoming population settles a region, the resident group doesn't have to be killed. They can be absorbed into a genetic minority so small it effectively disappears within a few generations. Children born to mixed households inherit the identity of the majority culture. Names change, language changes, and eventually the genome of the smaller group becomes statistically invisible. That is what appears to have happened here, and it raises a question that history rarely asks about its victors. What if the Slavic expansion, celebrated across modern national narratives from Poland to Serbia to Russia, was not just a story of people arriving? What if it was equally, and simultaneously, a story of people ceasing to exist? Hold that, because the next piece of evidence is the one that makes this personal. In Poland, less than 7% of the genetic material in the modern population traces back to the people who lived there before the Slavs arrived. Say that number slowly, 7%. In a nation of 38 million people, the genetic inheritance of the entire pre-Slavic population, people who had occupied that land for centuries before the first Slavic community, planted its first housepost in the Polish soil, amounts to less than 1 part in 14 of the modern gene pool. And that is the generous interpretation of the data. The Leipzig team's analysis showed that in some areas of the Elba-Sali region in eastern Germany, directly in the path of the westernmost Slavic migration, up to 85% of ancestry in early medieval burial sites could be attributed to the incoming Eastern European population, 85%, which means the people who had been there before, who had built their cemeteries in that soil, who had traded with Roman merchants and navigated the rivers of what would become Germany. They contributed 15% or less to the next generation's genome. These are not abstractions. These are specific human beings who show up in the data, then stop showing up. Men buried with the tools of their trades. Women interred with the distinctive jewelry styles of their culture. Children who never grew up to have children of their own, who carried their genes forward in any meaningful proportion. Dr. Joshua Gretzinger, whose team sequenced 555 ancient individuals across 26 sites, publishing the results in Nature in September 2025, was careful with his language. He noted varying degrees of cultural assimilation. He described regional heterogeneity. He was a scientist doing what scientists do. measuring carefully, describing precisely, not overclaiming. But the numbers don't require overclaiming. The numbers speak with unusual clarity. Here's what I keep coming back to. Every modern Polish person carries on average the genetic inheritance of a people who migrated from the Dniester and Don region sometime in the 6th or 7th century CE. That is who the Polish genome traces to. Not the wheelbark people, not the northern European populations who held that land before. The migrants, the people who arrived and, within 2 generations, constituted the overwhelming genetic majority. And nobody, not a single historical chronicle, not a single folk memory, not a single piece of oral tradition, preserved the name of the people they replaced. They existed. They had a culture, a genetic identity, a relationship to that land. And then, in the span of what was probably one human lifetime, they were reduced to a number so small it barely registers, 7%. But here's what the data showed next. And this is the part that changes the shape of the entire story. Because in one corner of Europe, surrounded by 1,000 years of German language and culture, a community of roughly 60, Zuzo people had done something that should have been genetically impossible. They held on. There is a region in eastern Germany called Lusatia. It sits in what is now Saxony and Brandenburg. Deep German territory, has been for centuries. And in Lusatia, there is a people called the Sorbs. About 60,000 of them remain. They speak a Slavic language called Sorbian. They have kept their festivals, their folk traditions, their distinct cultural identity, through the 30 Years' War, through Prussian annexation, through Nazi Germany's attempt to eradicate them, through the GDR's forced assimilation programs, and their genome, confirmed by genetic studies and now reinforced by the Leipzig team's ancient DNA, data is almost identical to the earliest medieval Slavic settlers who arrived in that region over 1,400 years ago. Bjarnat Sig is a Sorbian cultural activist and linguist in Bautzen, Budician and Sorbian, who has spent decades documenting the language before it disappears entirely. He knows, as all Sorbs do, that they are surrounded, that the German majority has absorbed most of what his people once were, that there are Sorbian villages where the last fluent speaker is in their 80s. He does not speak about genetics when he talks about why the Sorbs matter. He speaks about memory, about the fact that a language carries a way of seeing the world that cannot be translated, only spoken. What the DNA now confirms is something stranger and more powerful than cultural persistence. The Sorbs are not just the linguistic remnant. They are a genetic archive. Their genome is, in measurable terms, 1,400 years old. While the population surrounding them shifted and absorbed and transformed over a millennium of European history, the Sorbs remain genetically close to the people who stepped out of the Dniester and Don corridor and walked west in the 6th century CE. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. We covered the Dinka people recently, a population in South Sudan who function as one of the clearest genomic reference points on the planet, almost unchanged for tens of thousands of years. The Sorbs are a different kind of living archive, not a Paleolithic remnant, but a medieval one, preserved not by isolation, but by defiance. If you watch that episode, do you think genetic continuity like this is an accident of geography or something else? Drop it in the comments. I want to know what you think. What the Sorbs represent, genetically, culturally, demographically, is a living proof of concept for something the Leipzig studies data implies about the broader Slavic expansion. This was not a monolithic people. It was never a single identity spreading uniformly. The data from Croatia shows a different pattern than Poland. The data from Eastern Germany shows a different pattern than Moravia. Across every site, the Slavic expansion looked different, because what was being built was not an empire with a plan, but a wave of families making individual decisions about where to go and who to become. Dr. Zuzana Hofmanova, who led the parallel study in Moravia, published simultaneously in Genome Biology, put it this way: the Slavic expansion was not a monolithic event, but a mosaic of different groups, each adapting and blending in its own way, suggesting there was never just one Slavic identity, but many. There was never just one. There were many. And in Lusatia, surrounded by German-speaking neighbors for over 1,000 years, one of those many is still here, still speaking, still, in the most literal biological sense, the same people who arrived from the East in the 6th century. The question is what that means for the people who didn't survive. There is something the genomic data shows about the Balkans that it does not show about Poland and Eastern Germany, and the difference is not subtle. In Croatia, in Serbia, in the broader northwestern Balkans, the Slavic arrival did not erase what came before, it mixed with it. The data from the Leipzig study shows that East European-related ancestry in modern Balkan populations often constitutes roughly half or less of the total gene pool. In some areas, Pre-Slavic Balkan populations contributed 20 to 25% of the ancestry in modern Croatian genomes, a finding confirmed by Todor Chobanov and Svetoslav Stamov at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, whose 2025 study in Frontiers in Genetics used 800 ancient DNA samples to trace exactly how Slavic genetic signatures mixed with pre-existing Balkan populations through the mechanism of the Avar Khaganate. The Avars, a nomadic steppe confederation that controlled the Carpathian Basin from the 560s CE onward, are the part of this story that most popular accounts skip entirely, and they shouldn't, because the Avars and the Slavs were not separate stories. They were entangled from the beginning. Chobanov's study found what it called cryptic Slavic signatures inside Avar Khaganate burial contexts, Slavic individuals buried within Avar communities. Slavic genetic ancestry being carried west not just through independent Slavic migration, but through the movement of mixed Avar Slavic populations. The Avars provided a military and political framework. The Slavs provided the demographic mass. And together, in the Balkans, they created something that was neither purely one nor the other, and whose genetic descendants are still working out, in political and cultural terms, what they are. The genetic fault line between northern and southern Slavic populations. The near-complete replacement in Poland and Germany versus the hybrid formation in Croatia and beyond. Maps with uncomfortable precision onto divisions that have not resolved in the 15 centuries since. Different degrees of mixing created different population profiles. Different population profiles produce different cultural identities. Different identities built different national stories. And those national stories, defended with the full force of political will, have produced conflicts across the 20th and 21st centuries that the people involved do not typically describe in genetic terms, but perhaps should. The data doesn't pick sides. The data shows continuity. It shows that what people call ancient divisions between Slavic populations, between Slavic and pre-Slavic, between North and South, between East and West, have a biological substrate that is older than every border on the map of modern Europe. And here is the thing about borders drawn over a biological substrate. They tend not to hold. Let me tell you what the cemetery at Velim looked like when the archaeologists began to read its DNA. Velim is in the Czech Republic, in the South Moravian region that was once the core territory of Great Moravia, one of the first major Slavic political entities. The state that in the 9th century would receive the missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, and become the birthplace of the Glagolitic script, the first writing system ever created specifically for a Slavic language. Velim is not a famous site. It is not in the tourist literature. It is a field. But the genomes extracted from its burials by Dr. Hoffmanova's team tell a story that goes beyond the political history of any single state. What the team found at Velim and confirmed across multiple sites in the Leipzig study was evidence of social organization unlike anything in the preceding migration period. The incoming Slavic communities were not organized as loose confederations of small nuclear families. They were built around large, multi-generational patrilineal pedigrees, extended kinship networks in which multiple generations of related men remained in the same community, while women of marriageable age moved between communities to prevent inbreeding. Geneticists call this patrilocality combined with female exogamy. You can call it something simpler, a society built around the father's line where sons stayed home and daughters traveled. The DNA made the pedigrees visible, not just inferred, but mapped. Grandfather to son across multiple generations at a single site, with the women in each generation arriving from different genetic backgrounds entirely. This is not how the people before them organized themselves. The pre-Slavic migration period communities showed smaller, less structured family units, no consistent multi-generational pedigrees, no systematic female exogamy, different rules, different social architecture. And this distinction matters more than it might seem, because social architecture is how a small migrating population turns itself into a majority within 2 generations. When you organize around patrilineal extended families, the community grows coherently. New families form outward from a stable genetic core. The social structure is self-replicating. It is, in purely biological terms, highly effective at occupying demographic space. The Slavic expansion was not an army. It was a reproductive and social strategy. And it worked with a thoroughness that, 14 centuries later, is still visible in every genome sequenced from the region. What it did not account for, what no such strategy ever accounts for, is what it costs the people already standing in that demographic space. There is a concept in population genetics called genetic memory. It is not metaphor. It refers to the measurable persistence of a population event, a migration, a bottleneck, a near extinction in the DNA of living descendants. Specific mutations, specific allele frequencies, specific patterns of variation that carry the signature of what happened to the people who came before. The genome is record. The genome is archive. The pre-Slavic populations of Central Europe, the people with Scandinavian-linked ancestry who occupied Poland, Eastern Germany, and parts of the Balkans before the 6th century CE, did not disappear without a trace. That less than 7% that survives in modern Polish DNA is not nothing. It is a signal. It is, in genomic terms, a ghost. Faint, barely detectable above the noise of 1,000 years of subsequent migration and mixing, but present, measurable. There. Every person of Polish ancestry carries it. Most will never know, and nobody in any culture or tradition or national history has ever given that signal a name, because the people who generated it had no descendants powerful enough to demand one be given. Think about what that means for the concept of a homeland. Poland is genuinely ancient. The Slavic settlement of that territory is real. The continuity between those 6th century migrants and the modern population is confirmed. Not symbolic, not metaphorical, but genomically documented. But the land itself was not empty when those migrants arrived. It held people. It held their dead, their settlements, their relationship to the rivers and forests of that place, and the historical narrative that grew up around the Slavic identity, the stories of ancient origins, of peoples rooted in the land since time immemorial, was built without acknowledging that a near-complete population replacement had occurred somewhere underneath it. This is not unique to the Slavic story. It happens everywhere. Every national origin narrative simplifies what the DNA is now showing to be vastly more complex, and in many cases, more violent. Not in the sense of swords, but in the quieter violence of one population's genes simply outrunning another's until the smaller number rounds down to zero. The data doesn't indict anyone. It doesn't assign blame. The people who migrated from the Dniester and Don corridor in the 6th century were not carrying out a plan. They were feeding their children and finding land and building the communities their social structure demanded. They were doing what humans do. But the genomic record is a different kind of history. It doesn't have a victor's perspective. It counts everyone, including the ones who lost. Here's what the science cannot tell you. It cannot tell you what the pre-Slavic populations of Poland called themselves. It cannot tell you what language they spoke, or what stories they told about their own origins, or whether they had a word for what was happening to them as the Eastern migrants arrived in increasing numbers, and the demographic balance shifted, generation by generation, in a direction that would eventually make their own grandchildren strangers in their own blood. The genomes of 555 ancient individuals have given us the clearest picture ever assembled of how the Slavic world came to be. The picture is extraordinary. It shows a migration of real scope and speed, organized around a kinship structure so effective it reshaped the genetics of an entire continent within 2 centuries. It shows regional diversity within that expansion. The near-complete replacement in the north, the hybrid formation in the south, the isolated communities like the Sorbs who held their genetic profile against every surrounding pressure for over 1,000 years. And it shows something else, a substrate, a layer underneath. People who were there first, whose DNA is now too faint in the modern population to reconstruct with any certainty, who left burial sites and grave goods and, in some cases, individual genomes that the Leipzig team was able to sequence and describe, but not name. If you carry Slavic ancestry, Polish, Ukrainian, Czech, Slovak, Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, Russian, you carry the genetic signature of the migrants from the Dniester Don corridor. That ancestry is real. It is yours. It connects you, in a direct biological line, to people who crossed a continent carrying their children and their kinship structures and their unfamiliar burial practices into lands that already had inhabitants. And somewhere in your genome, in a signal so faint it barely registers against the larger signal of who the Slavs became, there may be a trace of the people who were already there. Less than 7% in modern Polish populations, perhaps even less in yours, perhaps more. The field hasn't fully characterized it yet. That trace has no name. No national flag flew over it. No chronicle preserved its language. No folk memory carried it forward through the centuries, the way the Sorbs carried their Slavic dialect through Lusatia, against every force that tried to silence it. But it is there, and the question the DNA opens, the one that no study, however comprehensive, however precisely sequenced, can close, is what we owe to a people we cannot name, whether the obligation to remember extends to the people history forgot before history was written, whether a homeland built on a prior disappearance is any less real or any less worthy for the silence underneath it. The Slavic world exists. It is one of the great demographic facts of European history. 500 million people on a continent speak Slavic languages today because a population from the Dniester Don region moved west in the 6th century with their families and their social structures and their stubborn, effective way of building communities that lasted. And somewhere beneath that fact, in the fraction of a modern Polish genome that traces to a Scandinavian-linked people whose name we do not know and whose story we have never told, there is a different kind of answer to the question of where you come from. Not the one you expected, not the comfortable one, the real one.